2024 is the biggest ballot year in history, with 2 billion people in 50 countries worldwide set to cast their vote. 2024 is also a critical year for Europe. Several EU countries are facing national and local elections, while in June, the world's biggest cross-border election will take place. More than 400 million people are expected to vote in the European elections and decide on the next European Parliament. According to the polls, a shift to the right is expected in many EU countries, with populist, radical, far-right parties gaining votes and seats across the EU. What impact would this have? At the same time, another key election will take place across the pond in November 2024, the US presidential election. The prospect of a Trump 2.0 presidency in combination with a revisionist Russia is forcing Europe to rethink defense and security policies at a very fast pace. Hi, my name is Gail Rago, and I'm your host for this episode of the Bold Europe podcast. In this episode, we'll discuss the rise of far-right parties in Europe and the next EU elections. We will try to understand how the Europe we know might change in 2024 and foresee how the EU's policy agenda and the direction of future EU legislation will be affected by it. And in line with this, we will also discuss the potential effects of an isolationist US administration after the November 2024 elections. To help us dig deeper into the subject, our guests today are Roderick Kefferputz, Director of the European Union Office of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. His expertise lies in the role of the EU in a changing world order and Europe's green industrial transformation. He is also a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Sophie Pornschlegel, Director of Studies and Development at Europe Jacques Delors, a Brussels-based think tank with a focus on sustainability and Green Deal issues. She teaches EU integration at Sciences Po Paris, and in November 2023, she published the book The End of the Usual Order: Why We Need to Rethink Power, in German. Welcome, Roderick and Sophie. I wanted to start our conversation today by looking at the general picture of the next EU elections. It's no secret that we will see a major shift to the right in many countries, with populist radical right parties gaining votes and seats across the EU, while center-left and green parties are losing votes and seats. So Roderick, let's start with you. In what ways do you think Europe has changed since the last European Parliament elections?
If I look back 5 years ago, I can say we were literally living in a different world. Kind of Lenin comes to mind. He once said there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. If we just look back the last 5 years, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic. We've had the biggest economic crisis since the Second World War. We actually have war in Europe again, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the EU has changed tremendously. And all of these challenges, I would say, the EU has successfully mastered over the last 5 years. It's done an incredible job on COVID-19, negotiating, finalizing contracts for vaccines, exporting over 1 billion vaccine doses worldwide. It has put forth an 800 billion next generation EU recovery package. This is really historic. The first time the EU issuing common debt at such a large scale for the big challenges of decarbonization, digitalization. It's done a lot on climate change with the European Green Deal, having a binding target for climate neutrality by 2050. And of course, for the Ukraine war, who would have ever thought we would use the European Peace Facility to finance arms and ammunition for Ukraine? I mean, nobody would have thought about this 5 years ago, and yet the EU has done it. And how has it done it? It's done it because the EU had a strong center. It had a strong European Commission, a strong leadership, and there was a strong majority of Greens, Liberal Democrats, Social Democrats, and Conservatives in the European Parliament. And what worries me, or the question that I have to myself is, can this center hold for the next policy cycle that we have?
Sophie?
I completely agree that Europe has changed tremendously in the past 5 years. And I think what's interesting to see is there's really a mix of punctual and systemic crisis at the same time. And I think the Commission, especially, has shown to be a very good crisis manager in the end. Like, I did not expect the Commission President von der Leyen to be the kind of crisis management commissioner, but she was, especially when it comes to the pandemic and then the war in Ukraine. And I think it shows also that, the EU had to become more geopolitical, even though it wasn't ready to. I think, especially from an institutional perspective, that means also a huge shift for the EU to become more geopolitical in its thinking. Yeah, I think someone said it quite well, who was Luc van Middelaar, who talked about moving from regulatory issues to questions of life and death, of solidarity, of peace. So I think there was clearly a shift, but it's true that the EU is quite a big tank and they're not very quick adapting. So sometimes it just takes a bit of a time. And I think in some issues, especially looking at the Green Deal, we don't necessarily always have the right tools and instruments to respond to those huge crises, whether they are punctual or systemic. And the second issue we face is that in the past 10 years, when we had this poly crisis, we could see that lots of journalists were saying, it's the end of the EU. I don't think that's the case. We see that there is some resilience, but the issue is that the more these systemic crises go forward and the less we find long-term sustainable solutions, the more complicated it will get. And I think you can see that, especially on the Green Deal, where we face a lot of backlash, where it's been much more difficult to find solutions that are really long-lasting and sustainable.
Due to the rise of the far right, every new national election in Europe presents a greater risk of platforming more conservative views at the European level. If the new European Parliament tilts to the far right, that would clearly have an impact on EU policies. For instance, more restrictive migration and asylum policies, more permissiveness perhaps on the conditionality of democracy and rule of law, or less assertiveness on energy transition and climate action, like you just mentioned, Sophie. So, Sophie, could you tell us, is the EU as we know it at risk? You actually just alluded to this, and you sounded optimistic, but I'd love to hear more.
I think it's not at risk straight away. I think it's wrong to think that, from one day to the next, we're going to see the end of the EU as such. I think there's a real resilience within the institutions, within the decision-making processes, within the expertise that has been built over the years. I'm sure that even looking back, you could always say there were naysayers that said it's the end of the EU, for instance, when we didn't manage to do a defense union, I think in the 70s. So you could always say it was never like a straightforward path. I wouldn't say it's a make it or break it moment, but it's a long-term question of like in which kind of tendencies and developments do we see. And there I'm much less optimistic in the sense that I see that there is a power shift away from Brussels towards the national capitals. You do have increasingly national decision makers that do not necessarily understand the need for the EU and the reason why it was built. And I think that lack of understanding of why do we actually need the EU to find common solutions and that we're stronger together, that's the biggest issue. And in the end, it's not institutions and processes and something that's very abstract. It's very much people focused. So if you don't have the right people in the right institutions at the right time, then it makes things much more complicated. And I think that there is a real shift away from the EU in terms of like trying to align national policy with European interests, trying to see how can we actually move forward, how can we find common initiatives. And being French and German, I think for me, it's quite sad to see that especially that couple or relationship is not doing well because they're not realizing the absolute need for the rest of Europe. We've seen an erosion of multilateralism. We've seen war at our doors. But I think that we would be able to tackle them if only we had an understanding that no country in Europe is big enough to face these challenges by themselves. And just to end up in a nice quote, I think it was Paul-Henri Spaak, one of the Belgian EU founders, who basically said that in Europe, you only have small countries or you have small countries that don't realize that they're small. And I think that shows it quite well. So I wish that France and Germany would understand that they're also quite small when it comes to China or the US.
Roderick, is the glass half full or half empty?
It's half. I mean, I completely agree with what Sophie said, and I love that quote from Paul-Henri Spaak as well. I mean, it's just so true. But I agree with what Sophie said on the doom and gloom. I don't think we don't need to engage in doom and gloom. I really believe in the strength of our European institutions. And we saw it a lot with the whole discussion also in the US on Donald Trump saying, oh, well, this is the end of American democracy. And well, guess what? American democracy might not look great, but it's still there. And the institutions have shown that they are resilient. I also think it's important for us not to just point fingers and say, oh, gosh, this is so awful. The far right or hard right populist might hold 25% of the seats in the next European parliaments. Instead of pointing fingers, we need to ask ourselves, well, why is that? Why are center ground parties losing ground to the far right, to the far left? Is it because we have a communication problem? Is it because we are not dealing with some of these bread and butter issues that citizens are concerned about? Is about the rise in inequality, and that people feel let down by some of the political elites that we have? So I think these are the questions that we really have to ask ourselves, and not fall into this, oh gosh, this is so terrible. The far right is increasing its political power. It is terrible, but let's do something about it as well. And because this is going to have an effect on the next European Commission, on the next policy cycle of the EU. I mean, the European Council on Foreign Relations, they've done a fantastic study that shows what kind of impact a stronger far right in the European Parliament would have. We would not have had the nature restoration law. We would probably not manage to have resolutions against Hungary on the rule of law and other important issues such as migration. The other point that Sophie made, which I thought was really good, was the effect a stronger hard right in the European Parliament would also have on the member state level. Because let's not forget, if you get into the European Parliament, you get a lot of resources, right? You get financial resources, you get staff resources, you get communication and some press resources, and that you can use in national elections. I mean, what was the first parliament the Front National in France entered, I think, was the European Parliament. One of the first parliaments the AfD entered was the European Parliament. And from there, they used the resources to then impact national elections. And right now we have one massive spoiler in the European Council, and that's Hungary's Orban. Well, in future, we might have Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. We might have Austria's FPÖ, who are going to have elections, and they're riding the polls very high. We don't know what the situation is going to be in Portugal, where the far-right Chega has just won quite significantly. And suddenly, it's not Orban who's going to be sidelined or who will be the spoiler of one, but we might have 3 or 4 people. And the problem is that they are impeding our capacity to solve problems. And if we cannot solve problems, people will become more disillusioned, will become more frustrated, and that might lead people to vote even more for the extreme right or the extreme left. And that's a real concern that I have.
I tend to agree with you, although I would say to me that the real solution would lie especially in the EPP and the Socialists and Democrats in particular. And I think you can also see it in Germany, you can see it at different national levels, that the big question is whether you do have a wall between the far right and the right. And I think the fact that we've seen especially parties in the center move so much towards the right and take over far right politics, that makes it much more acceptable and influences a lot of people. And I think that is the main issue. If we would have left them aside, I think it would have been much easier, but that's not what we're seeing. And I think what will be very interesting in the next European elections is to see how the EPP and the ECR will work together, because it very much looks like they will. And they tend to portray ID as the real far right, as the real crazy people, and to mainstream ECR to make it look like they are conservatives and they're not just, far right extremists, which they are. You do have Brothers of Italy, which are new fascist parties in there. You do have PIS, who spent years and years destroying democracy in Poland. So I think it's very important also to say these things, because I feel that there's a lot of political instrumentalization in trying to make them look as if they were, a normal political ideology when they're not. And I think that's the real danger here in making it acceptable, and therefore also completely shifting the narrative and the public debate into a much more far right corner, and to mainstream all of that. And you can see that in every European country, I would say, on different issues. I think especially on migration, when it's really polarized, on Green Deal as well, there's a real populist wave in trying to find very simple answers to complex issues. I don't think that they find the right answers to the issues we face. Like, we do have a climate crisis. Saying no to an EU nature restoration law is not going to help farmers in the long term. Even though they pretend to be on the side of citizens and different local communities, in the end, they're not really. Like, this is very short-termism rather than finding real solutions to real political issues.
This is really getting to the heart of the matter, right? Because the question is really, to what extent does the center, which I said in the beginning, to what extent does the center hold? Because if you suddenly have those populists from far right and far left coming, the center might be swayed by exactly the point that you made, becoming more populist itself, taking on some of those narratives from the far right and others that will not lead to us having further solutions.
Sophie, you just actually talked a little bit about the European Green Deal, which seems to have been captured by contemporary culture wars. Can Europe really afford to pause climate action as a way to bar the advance of the far right? Could you paint us a picture of how things stand currently, Sophie?
Yes, I'd love to. I mean, that's what we're working at Europe Jacques Delors mostly, really focusing on Green Deal sustainability issues and looking where it's going. And I think in the past 5 years, we had a very ambitious Green Deal. Like, I was very happy to see that an EPP politicians really took on an ambitious climate agenda. And I would say that the Commission did propose quite a lot, so they were very active on the topic. But now, 5 years later, we see that there is a political instrumentalization. So I don't see a Green Deal 2.0 coming. There's other issues that, have a priority in the EU agenda, which is going to be mostly defense and competitiveness, single market issues, industrial policy. So the question now is, how do you link those things? Because there needs to be a strong focus on implementation. We're not done with the Green Deal, we're far from there if you want to reach the climate targets. It needs to be focusing on implementation, and there needs to be a focus on making sure that the green transition is put in different policy fields, so that we do have, for instance, economic security, but that we do think of it through a green transition angle, that we do think of competitiveness, but to think of how do we make sure that we are competitive while transitioning to a net zero world. And I think that's the big issues that we will face now. I think the EU will face two issues in that respect. One will be to make sure that we have the right governance structures for it, because for now there's a lot of, working in silos, not having the expertise at the right place, making sure that there is like a real push and coherence in the policy fields towards the green transition. And the second issue is going to be funding. For instance, the Common Agricultural Policy is clearly not aligned on the Green Deal. It's a huge chunk of the EU budget. So how do you make sure that that money is actually spent towards the green transition? And also, how do you make sure that there is no dilemmas existing between, for instance, a stronger defense budget and the green transition budget? So I think there's a lot of funding issues as well that, will be very politicized and very difficult to solve as well.
Roderick, your 2 cents?
I think we're entering a new phase of the green transformation. I mean, this is really the decisive decade, and this is the tough part where we'll see a lot of distributional conflicts. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? Who are profiting from the green transformation? And who are the people that feel left behind? And I think one important dimension is that we have clear communication on this with clear expectations as well. And I think we need to focus much more also on the social dimension of the green transformation. The social dimension can't just be an afterthought where we realized, there are some losers, well, let's help them out. The social dimension needs to be integrated into the green transformation. And a lot of it, of course, is about finance. What Sophie mentioned, that we'll see distributional conflicts and pressures on budgets. This is happening in a lot of EU member states and will happen for the next EU budget as well. How much money are we going to invest in defense? How much money are we going to invest in the ecological transformation? How much is going to go into social issues? And particularly for the green transformation, I think we need to try and leverage private capital markets a bit more. So how can we use private finance? And what role also can central banks play? We at the Böll Foundation here in Brussels have just published, together with Positive Money, a study on what role the ECB could play when it comes to climate change and how they could put in place certain policies to promote the green transformation as well. I think we also need to look at the green transformation from a competitiveness point of view. So what's the United States doing? With the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, they're putting a lot of money up front. They're really investing in green tech and moving forward. China is putting a lot of money in the green transformation. And if we now pause the green transformation, I think we're going to be left behind. We're going to lose out in this race of competitiveness. And the other point is, and that's the one that Sophie made as well, is the question of economic security. The green transformation actually increases our security. When we have renewable energy and energy produced here in Europe and not dependent on authoritarian countries such as Russia or Saudi Arabia, that benefits us. That makes us more secure and makes us more competitive. And I think that's where this next phase of the green transformation is going to, and what we need to focus on, and how we need to also argue in favor of the green transformation.
I think it's very important what Roderick just said, especially looking at the fair transition. I would maybe just complement it with another aspect, which was also an afterthought when the Green Deal started, which is the, I would say, geopolitical and development effects that we would also have in the world. And so, looking at green diplomacy through that, we do work on green trade at Europe Jacques Delors. And what was very interesting is that the entire development policy was not really taken into account. So we had a carbon border adjustment mechanism. We did have an EU deforestation regulation without really taking into account the effects it would have on our trading partners. So I think it's great to have those tools to use trade policy for a green agenda. But then the question is also, how does this affect our relations, especially with the global south, with countries that do not necessarily have the resources to have a green transition like we do, and how do we help them? And I think having those cross-cutting issues much more thought through also requires the EU to change their habits and ways of doing things, which makes it very difficult because it needs to be reflected internally in the governance structures. We do have a very systemic competition between US and China. We do have an erosion of multilateral organizations that makes it much harder for the EU to move in the world and at the global stage, especially when it comes to the WTO, when it comes to trade, for instance, and that we do not necessarily, once again, have the right investment tools at EU level to do that. We do have, for instance, the important projects of common European interest, IPCEs, to try to leverage money for batteries and green hydrogen, but it's nothing compared to the levels to which the US, for instance, can invest in clean technologies. And to think that we have also a fragmented single market, and I know there's a report coming out from Enrico Letta soon from the Institute in Paris, which looks at that, but I don't think that having huge national subsidies for your own industries, once again, France and Germany being in the lead, will help us long term. So to make sure we have a cohesive single market and have common pots of money and funding to make sure that the green transition works and that we stay competitive at the global stage is really something that especially national decision makers need to understand. And that also means, accepting that the Commission might take the lead on that or to give more money to the Commission. And that's hugely political and controversial because in the end, it's national economics ministries that want to stay in the lead, but I'm not sure that long term it will profit them.
This is our traditional Did You Know section, where we provide an additional piece of context to the podcast conversation. Today, we are discussing the EU elections that will take place in June 2024. But there are other elections we need to keep an eye on, some taking place in full democracies and others just a mere plebiscite of autocratic regimes. Taiwan, Portugal, India, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, Ukraine, and the UK. Also Russia, Belarus, Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea. Perhaps one of the most relevant elections for the EU are the US elections, happening in November 2024. The war in Ukraine has imposed a shift on the EU agenda, with defense and security policies now at the center of the debate. The EU and its member states have rushed to help Ukraine, with some exceptions, such as Hungary. But Kiev survived mainly thanks to the USA. A potential Trump 2.0 presidency would increase the isolationism of the USA and its disengagement in NATO, which means the burden of helping Ukraine would be on the EU's shoulders only. At the same time, the EU has to find a new way to exert its power and confront autocracies, especially with the less globally engaged US to rely on. We will discuss this subject in the next part of our conversation. Defense and security are ever more present in EU debates, particularly since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. And both of you have kind of referred to this already in terms of the Green Deal as well. Roderick, do you believe that Europe is ready for the unexpected? What could happen, for example, in Europe if Trump wins the US presidential election?
We need another podcast for this scenario. This is such a big question. And this discussion is reaching fever pitch. People are talking about we need the EU nuclear umbrella. We need the EU defense commissioner. We need the EU army. And look, I'm going to be super cynical here. If Trump wins, what do we need to do? We need to buy him off. You know, Trump is the king of the art of the deal. We need to make sure we put enough money into our defense budgets. We need to make sure we spend more on defense, particularly for the defense of Ukraine. And a lot of that defense money is going to go to US armaments companies or US military companies. And so hopefully that's one way to entice Trump to still keep the US supporting Europe when it comes to security and defense. But of course, we have to also do more for ourselves, not just because, under Trump, it's a bit erratic and it might be uncertain whether the US will stick by Europe's side. We need to just make sure that we can also defend ourselves. And that might even entail a change in NATO's strategic concept. It's great that NATO has expanded now, that we've just have Sweden join, we've had Finland join. But, NATO's strategic concept basically foresees the following scenario. If the Russians were to invade the NATO alliance member states, then Europe would slow down the Russian advance until US troops arrive in time to push them back. And maybe there won't be enough time, and maybe they will never come. We don't know. So I think we need to have also other concepts in place, other thinking in place to make sure that we could defend the EU and defend the alliance. And that just means investing a lot more. And that also means getting armaments from outside the EU if necessary. I mean, it's been a real shame what's been happening with Germany and France, where we go back to the point that Sophie made earlier, how this important relationship is just not able to move forward on some crucial issues, such as the European Peace Facility and the question on arming Ukraine and supplying weapons to Ukraine. I mean, fundamentally, it boils down to, I don't care where the ammunition is coming from, whether it comes from South Korea or whether it comes from the EU. Ukraine needs the ammo, and, that's really matters. And last but not least, also, we shouldn't forget that the EU is a big economic player. Our single market has power. And we have also shown this under the last Trump administration, that if Trump hits us with tariffs, we can hit back. And we can also hit in places that might really hurt him and his constituency. I think we put Jean-Claude Juncker put tariffs on, what was it, American bourbon and Harley Davidson, like the quintessential American products. And I think that's how you have to deal with Trump. You have to try to buy him off. You have to try and schmooze him. Shinzo Abe, the late Japanese leader, was one of the person who really understood that art. He invited Trump to play golf with him in Japan and had a whole bunch of Japanese PGA pro professionals with him. And before they started, they told the Japanese professionals, please lose. You have to lose. We have to let Trump win. And that made Trump like Shinzo Abe. And, I think you have to really cynically, but I think you just have to go with the base instincts of Trump and try to play them to your advantage.
I don't think that's even cynical. I think that's just smart strategic politics of having to deal with a bigger power that has a pretty nutcase leader. I think that's the only way Europe can deal with it. It has to be strategic with a Trump in the White House because we're the smaller partner here. And it's true that we do have certain advantages when it comes to our single market. There is still some kind of leverage that we have. And I think using that leverage will be what the EU and its leaders need to do. That's definitely, I agree with that. Although I would say that maybe the French won't be happy to hear that, we should buy ammunition outside of Europe. But that's another topic.
Sophie, let's talk about your new book where you explain that to shape the world, one has to talk about power. Very interesting concept. And in that context of, or in a context of polycrisis rather, a new understanding of power is needed. You also write that Germany, Europe, and on a global level, we can achieve a more democratic understanding of power that gives us more options. Why do you think it's so difficult for Europe to talk about power? And how do liberal democracies powerfully confront autocracies?
Yes, thank you for the question and also for the opportunity to present the main thesis of my book, which got out last autumn in German. Also, very hard to translate books. So, in case some English language publishing house is interested, please, link me up. The whole idea of why I wanted to write a book is because working in think tanks and close to the political environment for years, we never really discussed power as such, even though it's really the mechanism and the tool to be able to change things, to have decisions. And I realized that not only are we not talking about it, there's also a very negative connotation of power. It's thought of in a very Machiavellian way. We're often thinking of power as something to manipulate and oppress people, to have power over people, to be very individualistic as well. We don't really think of power as power to do things, and we also don't think of power as power with other people. So collective power was also something I was very interested in. And especially in Germany, it's very taboo for, of course, historical reasons. The whole idea of the EU was to make sure we make things very boring, dull, and technocratic and depoliticized to take decisions. But that has really shifted. And therefore, there is power in the EU institutions after all. And that means we also need to start talking about it and to start thinking about how do we make sure to have a concept of power that is completely compatible with democracy and not based in very regressive Machiavellian thinking, especially when we have to face much more authoritarian leaders that have an even more regressive understanding of power, that really think of power as something to oppress others. But yeah, so I think that was the reason why I was so interested in trying to understand better the concept of it and to make sure that we have a much more democratic understanding of power. Also, and that's really the main reason and the main objective I had with this book, to rehabilitate political power and democratic political power, especially as we see that a lot of non-elected actors have more and more power, such as Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They have huge wealth, which with it comes huge political power, huge influence, and there is no democratic legitimacy to it. So that's not the way I would want things to go, but that also means we need to rehabilitate political power, democratic power. And that starts with a self-reflection about how do we show up and what is our power understanding, and do we have an understanding of power that is compatible with democracy or that is very much regressive and linked in, individualistic power plays.
Excellent. Thank you both for a very powerful discussion. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie.
And that's a wrap for the 14th episode of the Bull Europe podcast, the podcast of the European Union office of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung in Brussels. Have a look at the new dossier on the 2024 EP elections, full of interactive graphics, contributions from our offices and partners throughout Europe, as well as a spotlight on the super election year 2024. Check out also our new publication with the Center for Strategic and International Studies on how Europe might approach an isolationist Trump 2.0 US administration. You can find this content on eu.bull.org. Finally, we recommend the new book by Sophie Porn-Schlegel, At the End of the Usual Order, Why We Have to Rethink Power, edited in German by Dromer. Until the next episode, goodbye.